The cold air cuts through Marcus Weber's lungs as he pauses on the narrow mountain path, his breath forming clouds in the late afternoon light. It's mid-September 2019, and he's been hiking alone through the Swiss Alps for 3 days now, following a trail that winds through some of the most isolated terrain in Central Europe. The silence here is absolute, broken only by the occasional cry of a distant bird or the whisper of wind through the high peaks. He's experienced, having traversed these mountains dozens of times, and he knows the difference between a shifting shadow and something real. But what darts between the rocks ahead of him is neither shadow nor imagination. It moves low to the ground, serpentine, roughly the length of a large dog, but impossibly fast. For just a moment, perhaps 3 or 4 seconds, Marcus sees it clearly as it crosses a patch of sunlit stone near the entrance to an old tunnel carved into the mountainside. The creature's body undulates in a motion that seems both fluid and alien, scales catching the light before it vanishes into the darkness of the tunnel mouth. His hands fumble for his phone, trembling not from the cold, but from something more primal, something older than reason. By the time the camera opens, there's nothing there. Just bare rock, ancient stone, and a gaping black entrance to a passage that's been there for centuries. Marcus stands frozen for nearly 10 minutes, waiting for it to reappear, but the mountain returns to its oppressive silence. This is how it always happens. A glimpse, a moment of terror, and then nothing but questions that will haunt the witness for the rest of their lives. What Marcus saw, or what he believes he saw, has a name in these mountains. The locals call it the Tatzelwurm, and his experience is far from unique. The morning mist clung to the Alpine peaks on a day in 1779 that would forever alter how educated men of science viewed the boundary between folklore and observable reality. In the sprawling estate of Baron Sigmund Zoas von Edelstein, an Austrian naturalist whose reputation stretched from Vienna to the Royal Society in London, a weathered farmer stood trembling in the grand library, his sleeves rolled back to reveal 4 parallel gashes that wept blood onto the polished floor. Baron von Zoas had spent the better part of his 43 years cataloging the natural world with the methodical precision that defined the Age of Enlightenment. His collections of minerals and alpine flora were renowned throughout the Habsburg Empire. He corresponded with the finest minds of his generation, men who believed that reason and empirical observation would eventually illuminate every dark corner of human ignorance. Yet now, as he examined the wounds on the farmer's forearms with a magnifying lens, he found himself confronting something that defied the neat categories into which he had organized the living world. The farmer's name was Josef Stangl, a man of perhaps 50 years whose face bore the deep lines of someone who had spent decades working the harsh mountain soil near the Bavarian-Austrian border. Stangl was not given to flights of fancy, according to the local priest who had accompanied him to the baron's estate. He attended Mass faithfully, paid his tithes without complaint, and had never been known to partake excessively in drink. These credentials mattered greatly to von Zoas, who had dismissed countless tales of mountain spirits and supernatural beasts as the products of superstitious minds clouded by schnapps and inherited fear. But Josef Stangl was stone sober, and his terror was undeniably genuine. The baron could see it in the way the farmer's hands shook as he recounted his encounter, in the sweat that beaded on his forehead despite the library's cool temperature, in the way his eyes darted toward the windows, as if expecting something to crash through the glass. This was not the theatrical fear of someone seeking attention or attempting to deceive. This was the primal dread of a man who had looked into the face of something his mind could barely comprehend. The incident had occurred 3 days prior, in the early hours before dawn, when Stangl had been checking his snare traps in the rocky terrain above his farmstead. He knew these mountains intimately, every game trail and limestone outcropping, every cave entrance and seasonal stream. He had walked these paths since childhood and had never encountered anything more threatening than the occasional irritable wild boar. But on this particular morning, as he approached a cave opening he had passed hundreds of times before, he heard a sound that made his blood freeze. It was a hissing, he told the baron, but not like any snake he had ever encountered. It carried a quality that seemed almost feline, a sibilant warning mixed with something that resembled a cat's aggressive growl. The creature emerged from the cave entrance with shocking speed. Stangl described it as roughly the size of a well-fed house cat, perhaps 2 feet in length from its blunt, almost flat face to the tip of its serpentine tail. Its body was covered in grayish-brown scales that caught the dim pre-dawn light, and it moved with a disturbing combination of reptilian undulation and mammalian purpose. But what transfixed Stengel, what invaded his dreams in the nights that followed, was the creature's face. It was neither fully feline nor fully reptilian, but some nightmarish fusion of both. The eyes were large and forward-facing like a cat's, gleaming with an intelligence that seemed to assess him as both threat and potential prey. The mouth, when it opened to hiss again, revealed rows of needle-sharp teeth. Most unnaturally, the thing possessed legs. 2 pairs of them, stubby and muscular, emerging from the front portion of its elongated body. They were too short to elevate the creature's belly far from the ground, giving it a low, crouching profile that reminded Stengel of a lizard, yet they moved with a coordination and strength that suggested something far more formidable than any common reptile. The creature used these limbs to propel itself forward in a rapid, scuttling motion that closed the distance between them in mere seconds. Stengel had raised his arms defensively, a purely instinctive reaction as the creature launched itself at him. The impact was surprisingly forceful for something so small, nearly knocking him backward. He felt the sharp claws rake across his forearms as he tried to push the thing away. The pain was immediate and intense, 4 parallel lines of fire across each arm. The creature's breath, he claimed, carried the nauseating stench of rotting meat and something else, something sulfurous that made his eyes water. For perhaps 5 seconds that felt like an eternity, Stengel grappled with the thing, feeling its surprising weight and density, its muscles coiling beneath those scaled plates. Then, as suddenly as it had attacked, the creature released him and retreated. It backed toward the cave entrance, never taking those unsettling eyes off him, hissing continuously. Stengel, bleeding and terrified, did not wait to see if it would charge again. He ran down the mountain path, stumbling over rocks and roots, not stopping until he reached his farmhouse where his wife screamed at the sight of his wounds and the expression of pure horror on his face. Baron von Zoes examined the scratches with the careful attention he would give to any biological specimen. The wounds were deep, consistent with claws rather than teeth, and arranged in a pattern that suggested a creature with 4 digits on each front limb. The spacing and depth were unlike anything he had seen from the known predators of the region. Their claws would have caused far more devastating trauma. Wildcats left different patterns. These marks suggested something with smaller paws but tremendous gripping strength, something that had held on tightly while its claws penetrated the flesh. The Baron found himself in an impossible position, caught between 2 irreconcilable frameworks for understanding the world. His scientific training demanded evidence, repeatability, a specimen that could be examined and classified. Yet here sat a credible witness with physical evidence that defied easy explanation. The Enlightenment promised that nature operated according to discoverable laws, that careful observation would reveal the truth behind even the strangest phenomena. But the Enlightenment also mocked superstition, dismissed folktales as the delusions of the uneducated masses. To publish an account of such a creature would be to invite ridicule from his peers, to risk the reputation he had spent decades building. Yet von Zoes was also a man of intellectual honesty. He had dedicated his life to the pursuit of knowledge, wherever it might lead. The farmer's account troubled him precisely because it bore none of the hallmarks of fabrication. Stengel had not claimed to see a dragon or demon. He had not attributed supernatural powers to the creature, or woven it into some moralistic tale about divine punishment. He had simply, plainly, described an animal, albeit one unknown to science. The description itself carried an internal consistency that rang true. The creature's behavior, aggressive defense of its territory near a cave den, made biological sense. Its physical characteristics, while unusual, were not impossible. Nature had produced stranger combinations, the platypus being the most famous example of an animal so bizarre that early specimens were thought to be hoaxes. The Alpine regions had long harbored stories of strange creatures. The mountains were repositories of ancient fears, places where the familiar world of cultivated valleys gave way to vertical wilderness where anything might lurk. Every village had its tales of spirits and monsters, handed down through generations. Von Zoes had dismissed these as primitive holdovers, the last gasps of medieval thinking in an age of reason. But what if some of these tales had kernels of truth? What if the mountains, with their countless unexplored caves and remote valleys, harbored species unknown to science? The Baron spent weeks wrestling with his decision. He interviewed Stengel multiple times, searching for inconsistencies in his account and finding none. He examined the wounds repeatedly as they healed, documenting their progression with detailed sketches. He consulted his extensive library, searching for any historical references to similar creatures. What he found surprised him. There were indeed scattered accounts, mostly dismissed as fantasy, of cat-faced serpents in the Alps. Local names varied by region, but certain descriptions appeared repeatedly across centuries. A creature neither wholly reptile nor wholly mammal, with a body like a snake but possessing legs, with a face that reminded observers of a cat or weasel. In the end, Von Zoes made a compromise with his conscience and his reputation. He recorded Stengel's account in meticulous detail in his private journals, complete with measurements of the wounds and sketches based on the farmer's description. But he did not publish it in any scientific journal. The risk to his credibility was too great, the evidence too singular, too impossible to verify. He did, however, share the account privately with a small circle of trusted correspondents, other naturalists, who he hoped might encounter similar evidence. In his letters, Von Zoes expressed his profound uncertainty, his sense that the neat boundaries between known and unknown, between rational and fantastical, were perhaps more permeable than the Age of Enlightenment cared to admit. What Baron von Zoes could not have known was that his careful documentation would establish the template for countless encounters to come. The description that Joseph Stengel provided that day in 1779 would be repeated with remarkable consistency over the following centuries by witnesses across the Alpine regions who had no knowledge of each other's accounts. The cat-sized body, the serpentine form, the stubby legs, the feline face, these elements would appear again and again, building a composite picture of a creature that defied classification but could not be entirely dismissed. The physical evidence Stengel carried on his arms posed a question that Baron von Zoes, for all his learning and scientific method, could not answer. In the space between Enlightenment certainty and Alpine mystery, between what could be proven and what had been experienced, something had left its mark on both the farmer's flesh and the historical record, and that mark would not fade. The Alpine dawn of August 13, 1934, broke cold and crystalline over the Graubünden region of eastern Switzerland. Hans Fuchs, a 38-year-old photographer from Basel, had risen early that morning at his modest guest house in the village of Meiringen, eager to capture the mountain landscapes in the pristine morning light. According to the innkeeper, who later testified to authorities, Fuchs had seemed in excellent spirits, discussing his planned route along the old mountain paths near the Furka Pass, with an enthusiasm that bordered on boyish excitement. He carried his professional camera equipment, a Leica 2 with several film plates carefully wrapped in leather, a thermos of coffee, and a small notebook where he meticulously recorded the technical details of each photograph he attempted. Nothing about that morning suggested the horror that would unfold just hours later. Fuchs had developed a reputation among the Alpine photography community as a meticulous craftsman, someone who would wait hours for the perfect confluence of light and shadow, who understood the mountains with the intimacy of a longtime lover. His work had appeared in several prominent Swiss publications, and he was building toward a book that would document the hidden corners of the Alpine world, those places where ancient rock met eternal snow, where civilization gave way to something older and less tame. On this particular morning, he sought a specific shot near one of the old railway tunnels that had been carved through the mountainside decades earlier, a place where human engineering intersected with the raw geology of the peaks. The tunnel itself stood as a testament to 19th century ambition. A dark mouth bored through solid granite to allow passage for trains that no longer ran this route. By 1934, it had been largely abandoned, used occasionally by hikers as a shortcut through the mountain during inclement weather. The local population treated it with a certain wariness, though whether this was due to practical concerns about structural integrity or something more superstitious remained unclear. Several villagers would later tell investigators that they avoided the area, particularly during the early morning and twilight hours, though their explanations for this avoidance were vague, couched in the careful language of people who feared mockery. What happened to Hans Fuchs in the vicinity of that tunnel remains one of the most debated incidents in cryptozoological history, a case that continues to divide researchers, skeptics, and believers more than 8 decades after the event. The discovery came shortly after noon. 2 local farmers, brothers named Josef and Karl Meyer, were traversing a high meadow path that offered a distant view of the tunnel entrance when they spotted what appeared to be a person lying motionless on the rocky ground, approximately 50 meters from the tunnel's mouth. The brothers later described an immediate sense that something was profoundly wrong with the scene. The figure lay in an unnatural position, Josef would tell police, sprawled as if thrown backward with considerable force. As they approached, running now with rising alarm, they could see it was a man clutching a camera to his chest with both hands, gripping it with such intensity that his knuckles had gone white even in death. Hans Fuchs lay on his back, eyes wide open and staring at the morning sky. His mouth was frozen in what the Meyer brothers could only describe as a scream, though no sound emerged from the corpse. The expression on the photographer's face would haunt both men for the rest of their lives. Karl Meyer, interviewed decades later by a Swiss journalist researching unexplained deaths in the Alps, said he had seen men killed in the Great War, had witnessed death in various forms, but he had never seen terror etched so deeply into human features. It was, he said, as if Fuchs had seen something that shattered not just his body but something fundamental in his understanding of the world. The camera remained locked in the dead man's grip. When the local constable arrived, summoned by the Meyer brothers, he had to pry the photographer's fingers from the leather-wrapped Leica, each digit rigid with rigor mortis and an intensity of muscular contraction that the officer found deeply unsettling. The constable, a practical man named Werner Kohler, who had served in the community for 15 years, noted in his official report that he had never encountered a body clutching an object with such desperate force. It suggested, he wrote, that in his final moments, Fuchs had considered this camera, and whatever image it contained, to be of paramount importance. The initial medical examination took place in the village of Chur, where the body was transported later that afternoon. Dr. Emil Ra, the regional medical examiner, conducted the autopsy the following morning. His findings, preserved in the cantonal archives, make for disturbing reading. Cause of death was determined to be acute cardiac arrest, a heart attack of massive proportions. For a man of 38 with no history of heart disease, an active individual who regularly hiked the demanding Alpine terrain, this was unusual, but not impossible. What troubled Dr. Roth? What caused him to file an addendum to his report and request a second opinion from a colleague in Zurich was the physiological evidence of extreme terror. The human body, when subjected to profound fear, undergoes dramatic changes. The adrenal system floods the bloodstream with hormones, the heart rate escalates, blood pressure spikes, and various other systems activate in the primitive fight or flight response. Dr. Roth found evidence of all these reactions amplified to an extraordinary degree. Fuchs's adrenal glands showed signs of massive hormone release. His heart tissue displayed patterns consistent with extreme stress, but most disturbing were the petechial hemorrhages in his eyes and the unusual levels of stress hormones still detectable in his blood even hours after death. It was, Dr. Roth noted, as if the man had literally been frightened to death, his body overwhelmed by a terror so profound that his heart simply ceased to function. But what had caused such fear? The area where Fuchs was found showed no signs of an attack. There were no wounds on the body, no defensive injuries, no indication of a struggle with another person or a wild animal. The mountain landscape offered no obvious hazards that might explain such panic. It was a clear day, good visibility, no sudden weather that might have disoriented him. The tunnel entrance sat quiet and empty, revealing nothing. The answer, or at least a deeply controversial clue, lay in the camera. When the film plates were developed 2 days later, most revealed exactly what one would expect from a professional landscape photographer working in the Alps. Mountain vistas, interesting rock formations, the play of light on snow and stone. But one image was different. One photograph showed something that would ignite a debate lasting decades and create one of the most analyzed, disputed, and controversial pieces of evidence in cryptozoological history. The photograph is blurry, compromised by what appears to be rapid motion, either of the subject or the camera itself. The image quality suggests it was taken hastily, without the careful composition and technical precision that characterized all of Fuchs's other work. It shows the area near the tunnel entrance, the rough stone and scattered boulders clearly identifiable. And in the foreground, occupying perhaps a third of the frame, is something that defies easy explanation. The creature, if creature it is, appears to be roughly 2 meters in length, low to the ground, with what looks like a scaled or segmented body. The head, such as it is visible through the blur, seems disproportionately large, and there's a suggestion of a wide mouth. The body tapers toward the rear, though whether it possesses legs or moves, serpent-like remains unclear due to the image quality. The scales, if that's what they are, appear to catch the light in a way that suggests something reptilian, something armored and ancient. Skeptics immediately seized upon the photograph's poor quality as evidence of fraud or misidentification. A blurry image proves nothing, they argue. It could be a log, a shadow, an optical illusion created by rocks and light. The fact that it's the only photograph Fuchs managed to take of the alleged creature suggests he either recognized his error or deliberately created a hoax before his conveniently timed death. Some propose that Fuchs had attempted to stage a cryptozoological discovery, that the stress of preparing or executing this hoax had triggered a genuine heart attack, giving tragic authenticity to a manufactured mystery. Others pointed out that Hans Fuchs had no history of interest in cryptozoology or mysterious creatures. He was a landscape photographer, a technician obsessed with light and composition, not the sort of person who chased legends. His professional reputation was solid, his work respected. Why would he risk everything for a hoax? And if he intended fraud, why produce such a questionable image? A skilled photographer would surely create something more convincing. The believers, those who accepted the possibility that Fuchs had encountered something genuinely unknown, noted the photograph's quality was entirely consistent with a panicked reaction shot. If a man suddenly confronted a creature he believed should not exist, a predator or monster from Alpine legend, would he carefully compose a photograph, or would he desperately snap a single image before fleeing? The blur suggested motion and panic, exactly what one would expect from a fatal encounter. Local testimony added strange dimensions to the case. In the weeks following Fuchs's death, investigators from both the cantonal police and several independent researchers interviewed residents of the nearby villages. A pattern emerged, fragmented and folkloric, but persistent. Multiple people claimed to have seen strange things near that particular tunnel over the years. A shepherd named Anton Berger described seeing what he called a stolen worm, a tunnel worm, emerging from the rocks near that same location 3 years earlier. He described it as long, scaled, moving with a sidewinding motion that was neither entirely snake-like nor lizard-like. He had told no one, he said, because who would believe such a tale? An elderly woman named Margarete Fischer recalled that her grandfather had warned her away from those tunnels as a child, saying that Tatzelwurms nested in the dark places, that the old tunnels disturbed their lairs and made them aggressive. The Tatzelwurm, a creature from Alpine folklore, typically described as a cat-headed serpent or lizard, something that lived in the high caves and emerged only rarely to bask on rocks or hunt. The legends stretched back centuries, woven into the cultural fabric of mountain communities, dismissed by modern rationalism as peasant superstition. But here was a modern man, a photographer with a camera, dead of apparent fright, with an image that at least superficially resembled the legendary creature. The coincidence troubled even the skeptics. The photograph was examined by several experts in the months following the incident. A professor of zoology from the University of Zurich concluded it was impossible to make a definitive identification from such a poor image, but acknowledged that the form did not clearly match any known alpine animal. A photography expert determined that the image had not been obviously manipulated or double exposed, that whatever appeared in the frame had been physically present when the shutter released. But this proved nothing, as a log or rock could be physically present and still create an optical illusion. Perhaps the most compelling argument for the encounter's authenticity comes from the medical evidence of Fuchs's final moments. Dr. Roth's analysis suggests a man dying of terror, a physiological response so extreme it killed him. Can a hoax, can a misidentified log or shadow generate that level of fear in a rational adult? Or did Hans Fuchs see something in those mountains that morning, something that reached past his modern understanding and triggered a primal panic, the ancient mammalian fear of the predator, the monster, the thing that should not be? The case remains open, in the sense that no definitive conclusion has ever been universally accepted. The photograph continues to circulate, analyzed by new generations of researchers with increasingly sophisticated tools. Some see only shadows and rocks. Others see evidence of an unknown species, a surviving remnant of something prehistoric, lurking in the remote Alpine heights where human observation remains sparse and imperfect. Hans Fuchs lies buried in Basel, his tombstone marking the dates of a life cut unexpectedly short. His camera, the Leica that captured that final controversial image, eventually made its way to his family, and then into private collection. The photograph itself exists in various archives, reproduced in books and articles about cryptozoology, alpine mysteries, and unexplained death. And the tunnel near Furka Pass remains, dark and silent, keeping whatever secrets it may hold. The darkness beneath the Alps holds secrets that predate written history, and among the most disturbing of these secrets are the scattered warnings carved into stone, warnings that speak of something that should not be disturbed. Deep within the forgotten mining tunnels that honeycomb the mountains, symbols etched by trembling hands centuries ago still mark certain passages as forbidden territory. These are not the organized warnings of modern safety protocols, but desperate messages scratched into rock by men who encountered something their medieval minds could barely comprehend. The relationship between the Tatzelwurm and the underground spaces of the Alpine region reveals a pattern that becomes impossible to ignore once you begin tracing it through historical records. Long before this creature had a standardized name, long before naturalists attempted to catalog it alongside known species, the people who dug into these mountains knew that something lived in the darkness below. The folklore speaks of it in careful, reverent terms: mountain spirits, tunnel guardians, the watchers in the deep. These were not merely superstitions invented to frighten children, but practical warnings passed down through generations of miners who learned through bitter experience that certain areas beneath the earth were claimed by something else. The medieval mining operations in the Alps were dangerous undertakings under the best circumstances. Men descended into unstable passages, lit by flickering torches, breathing air thick with dust and the smell of disturbed earth, always aware that the mountain could claim them at any moment. But the records from these operations reveal something more specific than general mining accidents. There are numerous accounts, scattered across different regions and different centuries, of work crews that simply refused to continue excavating in particular directions. These were not men easily frightened. They faced cave-ins, flooding, and toxic gases as part of their daily labor. Yet something they encountered in certain tunnels broke their resolve completely. In the Tyrol region, a mining operation dating back to the 13th century contains markings that have puzzled historians for generations. Along one particular shaft, now collapsed and accessible only through careful archaeological excavation, workers carved a series of symbols that appear nowhere else in the tunnel system. These marks include what appear to be serpentine forms with pronounced front limbs, accompanied by words in Old German that translate roughly to here: "It watches and turned back, the guardian remains." The tunnel beyond these warnings was abandoned while still showing signs of rich mineral deposits. Whatever drove those medieval miners away was powerful enough to make them leave potential wealth untouched in the darkness. The written accounts that survive from this era are frustratingly vague, filtered through the religious and superstitious lens of the time. A mining journal from 1497, preserved in a monastery in Bavaria, describes how workers in a silver mine reported hearing a hissing most unnatural, like unto a great serpent, but with the fury of a wild cat. The foreman recorded that 2 men refused to return to that section of the mine, claiming they had seen a thing that moved wrong, with the front of a beast and the back of a worm, and eyes that reflected our torchlight with a glow most terrible. The passage was sealed, and the journal notes that it was marked with protective symbols by the local priest. These medieval accounts establish a baseline, a foundation of something dwelling in the deep places that predates modern sightings by centuries. But it was the railway tunnel construction of the 1800s that brought this phenomenon into the industrial age and generated a surge of encounters that could not be as easily dismissed as superstitious ramblings. The expansion of the railway system through the Alps required tunneling on an unprecedented scale. Thousands of workers equipped with explosives and steam-powered drilling equipment began forcing passages through mountains that had remained largely undisturbed since their formation. The Gotthard-based tunnel construction, which began in 1872, became infamous among workers for reasons that went beyond its already dangerous conditions. Crews reported encounters with creatures fleeing the excavation sites, hissing and scrambling into side fissures and unexplored passages. These were not isolated incidents reported by single individuals, but collective experiences involving multiple witnesses. A supervisor's log from 1876 describes an incident where blasting opened a natural cavity within the rock, and workers reported seeing several serpentine forms, roughly the length of a man's arm, with cat-like heads and small forelimbs, retreat rapidly into cracks too narrow for pursuit. The description is notably specific and consistent with other Tatzelwurm accounts from completely different locations and time periods. What makes the railway tunnel sightings particularly significant is the social context in which they occurred. These were modern industrial workers, many of whom had migrated to the Alps from other regions and had no exposure to local folklore about mountain creatures. They were supervised by engineers trained in the rational sciences of the Victorian era, men who had little patience for superstition. Yet the reports persisted, and more tellingly, they followed a predictable pattern. Encounters occurred most frequently when excavation broke through into previously sealed cavities within the rock, into ancient water channels and natural fissures that existed in complete darkness and isolation from the surface world. The creature's apparent habitat preferences began to emerge from these accumulated reports. Darkness was clearly essential, as sightings almost universally involved creatures fleeing from light sources, whether torchlight in medieval mines or the acetylene lamps of railway workers. Moisture appeared to be another critical factor. The vast majority of encounters occurred in sections of tunnels where water seeped through the rock, where the air hung heavy with humidity, and the stone glistened with condensation. Depth mattered as well. Surface caves and shallow excavations rarely produced reports, but once digging extended beyond a certain threshold, once tunnels pushed into the true depths of the mountains, the encounters began. This suggests a creature exquisitely adapted to a specific environmental niche. The deep limestone cavities and water-carved passages within the Alps create a unique ecosystem, one that exists in perpetual darkness and maintains relatively stable temperatures year-round. In this environment, disconnected from the seasonal variations of the surface world, life could theoretically evolve along very different pathways. The Tatzelwurm's described characteristics, its pale coloration noted in some accounts, its apparent sensitivity to light, its preference for damp environments, all align with what we might expect from a creature that has spent countless generations adapting to subterranean existence. The psychological impact of these encounters on the workers themselves deserves examination. These were men performing back-breaking labor in conditions of extreme danger, where death from accidents was common enough to be almost routine. Yet it was not the threat of cave-ins or explosions that caused them to mark certain tunnels as forbidden and refuse to continue excavation in specific directions. There is something deeply unsettling about encountering life where we expect only stone and darkness, about realizing that we have invaded a territory that something else considers its own. The hissing sound reported so consistently in these accounts carries particular psychological weight. It is a sound of aggression, of warning, a clear communication that transcends species barriers. When those railway workers heard that hissing emerging from the newly blasted cavities, they understood on a primal level that they were not welcome. The folklore about tunnel guardians and mountain spirits now appears less like fantasy and more like an early attempt to categorize and understand these encounters. The old stories speak of spirits that protect the treasures of the mountain, that punish those who dig too greedily and too deep. But strip away the supernatural language, and what remains is a description of territorial creatures defending their habitat from human intrusion. The tradition of leaving offerings at the entrance to mines, a practice documented throughout the Alpine mining regions, takes on new significance when viewed through this lens. Perhaps these were not symbolic gestures to appease imaginary spirits, but practical attempts to avoid conflict with something very real that lived in the depths. Modern cave exploration and geological surveys have revealed just how extensive the natural cavity systems within the Alps truly are. Thousands of kilometers of passages wind through the limestone, many still unexplored, most completely inaccessible without specialized equipment. These systems contain rivers and lakes that have never seen sunlight, ecosystems sustained by minerals and bacteria rather than photosynthesis. We have discovered eyeless fish, colorless crustaceans, and other creatures adapted to this eternal darkness. Is it truly unreasonable to consider that something larger, something more complex, might also have found a way to survive in these hidden spaces? The pattern of human excavation repeatedly disturbing the Tatzelwurm's territory explains the episodic nature of sightings throughout history. During periods of intense mining or tunnel construction, encounters spike. During quieter periods, when the mountains are left relatively undisturbed, the reports diminish. This is not the pattern we would expect from a creature that hunts or scavenges near human settlements. This is the pattern of something that prefers to remain hidden, that emerges or is encountered only when its territory is invaded by our relentless digging. The warning symbols carved into those medieval tunnels carry a message across the centuries. They tell us that our ancestors, lacking our modern certainty about what is and is not possible, took these encounters seriously enough to mark their locations permanently in stone. They chose to abandon valuable mineral deposits rather than continue pushing into spaces that something else inhabited. Perhaps they understood something that our modern rationality has caused us to forget. Perhaps they recognized that the mountains hold secrets that are best left undisturbed, and that some darkness should remain unexplored. In the spring of 1954, the Müller family lived what most would consider an ideal existence in the Austrian countryside, about 20 kilometers southeast of Salzburg. Heinrich Müller, a postal clerk, had purchased the property 3 years earlier with money inherited from his late father. The house was modest but sturdy, with whitewashed walls and a red-tiled roof that gleamed in the morning sun. Behind the main dwelling stood a barn that housed 6 dairy cows, 24 chickens, and a small pen for their 3 pigs. The property stretched across roughly 8 hectares of mixed farmland and forest, bordered on the eastern edge by the remnants of a railway line that had been abandoned since the war. The tunnel that cut through a small hillside at the far corner of their land had fascinated Heinrich when he first viewed the property, and he had imagined his children playing there someday, exploring its dark recesses with the fearless curiosity of youth. Heinrich's wife, Margarete, kept a detailed diary throughout their years on the property. This habit, which she had maintained since girlhood, would later provide historians and researchers with an invaluable record of what transpired during those 3 terrifying weeks in March and April of 1954. Their children, Klaus, who was 12, and Anneliese, who had just turned 16, were typical of rural Austrian youth at that time, accustomed to chores and outdoor life, knowledgeable about animals and weather, grounded in the practical realities of farm existence. The first entry that hints at something unusual appears in Margarethe's diary on the 7th of March. She wrote simply that the dogs had been restless for 2 nights running, whining and pacing near the windows that faced toward the old railway cutting. She noted this almost in passing, the way one might mention an unexpected change in weather or a neighbor's new automobile. The entry suggests no particular concern, only mild annoyance that the animals were disturbing the household's sleep. 3 days later, the tone shifts perceptibly. Margarethe wrote that Heinrich had gone out after midnight with a lantern, following the dogs who had run barking toward the abandoned tunnel. He returned an hour later, muddy and irritated, reporting that he had found nothing but claiming to have heard what he described as a hissing sound, like steam escaping from a locomotive boiler, though no trains had used that line in over a decade. He dismissed it as wind moving through the tunnel's dark throat, but Margarethe noted in her careful script that her husband had seemed unsettled, that he had checked the locks on the doors twice before returning to bed. The family's letters from this period, preserved by descendants who still live in the Salzburg region, provide additional perspective. In a letter dated the 13th of March, Heinrich wrote to his brother in Vienna, mentioning in an almost joking manner that they might have a vagrant taking shelter in the old tunnel. He wrote that he planned to investigate properly on the weekend, perhaps bring the police constable if the situation seemed to warrant it. The letter's tone is light, unconcerned. The words of a man who considers the matter a minor nuisance rather than anything approaching a threat. But the weekend brought something that transformed the family's mild concern into genuine unease. On the morning of the 16th of March, Heinrich discovered that one of the pigs was missing. The pen's gate stood open, though he insisted he had secured it the night before. More disturbing were the marks in the mud around the enclosure, deep gouges that looked, according to his description in a subsequent letter, like something had been dragged through the earth. The tracks led toward the forest, toward the old railway cutting, before disappearing into underbrush too thick to follow. Klaus later recalled, in an interview conducted by his grandson in 2007, that his father had been visibly angry that day, convinced at first that thieves had struck the property. Heinrich spent hours examining the pen, looking for signs of how someone might have lured or carried away a pig that weighed nearly 90 kilograms. But the more he looked, Klaus remembered, the more confused his father became. The gate had not been forced open. There were no footprints of the kind a man would leave, no sign that a vehicle had come near the property during the night. Margarethi's diary entry from that evening is longer than usual, her handwriting less controlled than in previous pages. She described how Heinrich had taken his hunting rifle and walked the entire perimeter of their property that afternoon, how he had returned silent and withdrawn. She wrote that at dinner, when Anneliese asked if they should inform the police about the theft, Heinrich had simply shaken his head and said nothing more about it. Margarethi noted that this silence frightened her more than any explanation would have. The hissing sounds continued, growing more frequent. Over the next week, multiple diary entries mentioned them. Sometimes they came shortly after dark, sometimes in the deepest hours of night. Margarethi described the noise as almost mechanical, a rhythmic pulsing hiss that seemed to echo from the direction of the tunnel. On the 21st of March, she wrote that all 4 family members had heard it clearly, standing together in the farmyard, listening as the strange sound rose and fell like labored breathing, magnified 1,000 times. The second animal disappearance occurred on the 24th of March. This time, it was one of the dairy cows, a docile creature named Liesel that Heinrich had owned since she was a calf. Again, the barn door stood inexplicably open at dawn. Again, there were those strange drag marks in the earth, deep parallel grooves that suggested something of enormous weight being pulled along the ground. Heinrich followed the trail for nearly a kilometer into the forest before losing it among the trees. Klaus, who accompanied his father that morning, described in his later interview how they had found patches of disturbed soil, areas where something large had clearly rested or struggled, but no blood, no hair, no clear indication of what had happened to Liesel. In a letter to her sister dated the 26th of March, Margarethi's fear becomes explicit for the first time. She wrote that Heinrich had taken to sleeping only a few hours each night, keeping watch with his rifle across his knees. She described how the children had become quiet and nervous, how Anneliese no longer wanted to feed the chickens alone, how Klaus startled at every unexpected sound. The loss of the cow represented a significant financial blow to the family, but Margarethi's letter makes clear that money had become secondary to a growing sense of wrongness that had settled over the property like a fog. The family began staying closer to the house as March gave way to April. Heinrich wrote to his supervisor requesting a few days' leave from his postal duties, explaining vaguely that he needed to attend to urgent matters at home. The remaining animals were locked in the barn each evening before dark, the doors secured with additional chains that Heinrich purchased in town. Margarethi noted in her diary that neighbors had begun to ask questions, curious about why the Mullers seemed so withdrawn, why the children no longer walked to the village in the evenings as they once had. Then came the daylight encounter, the event that would ultimately drive the family from their property and leave a mark on Anneliese Müller that would persist for the rest of her life. It was the 8th of April, a Thursday afternoon with clear skies and mild temperatures. Anneliese had been hanging laundry in the yard, a basket of damp sheets beside her, clothespins in her apron pocket. The time was approximately 3 o'clock in the afternoon. This detail is confirmed both by Margarethi's diary and by a letter Anneliese herself wrote 2 weeks later to her closest friend, a letter that her friend's daughter eventually donated to a regional folklore archive in 1998. Anneliese wrote that she had heard movement at the edge of the forest, about 50 meters from where she stood. At first she thought it might be a deer, though the sound was wrong somehow, heavier and more deliberate than the careful steps of a wild animal accustomed to stealth. She described how she had turned, curious but not yet frightened, expecting to see perhaps a neighbor's dog or a stray farm animal. What she saw instead would haunt her for 6 decades. The creature emerged from the tree line in full daylight. Annaliese's descriptions, recorded in multiple sources over the years, remained remarkably consistent. It had a length of perhaps 4 or 5 meters, though she admitted that terror might have distorted her perception. The body was serpentine, covered in what looked like dark, glistening scales or skin that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. But what made the thing truly nightmarish, what separated it from any known animal, were the front limbs. The creature possessed 2 powerful forelegs positioned near what she assumed was its head, though she could never bring herself to look directly at that end of its body. These legs ended in something between paws and hands, digits that seemed to grip the earth as it moved. But there were no rear legs, no second pair of limbs. The back portion of its body simply trailed behind, thick and muscular, tapering to a point. The method of locomotion Annalise described has been verified by no known animal. The creature would plant its front legs firmly in the soil, then gather its long body beneath itself in a humping motion similar to how an inchworm moves before thrusting forward again. But the power in this movement was tremendous, she wrote. Each thrust propelled it forward nearly 2 meters, the muscular body uncoiling with visible force. Between these hopping lunges, the creature's lower body would slither, adjusting position, the entire length of it moving with a horrible fluid grace. The sound it made matched exactly what the family had been hearing for weeks. A rhythmic hissing that pulsed in time with its breathing, or perhaps with the effort of movement. Annalise stood frozen for what she estimated was several seconds, but might have been longer, her mind struggling to process what her eyes reported. The creature, she wrote, seemed to be moving parallel to the forest edge, not directly toward her, but not away either, as if patrolling or searching for something. Then it turned what she assumed was its head in her direction, and though she never saw eyes or features that she could later describe with certainty, she felt absolutely certain that it had noticed her, that some form of awareness had locked onto her presence. She dropped the laundry basket and ran, screaming for her father, not looking back until she had reached the house and thrown herself through the door. Heinrich grabbed his rifle and rushed outside, Klaus close behind him. Margaretha's diary records that they searched the area thoroughly but found nothing except the dropped basket and, more disturbingly, a trail in the grass where something large and heavy had compressed the vegetation. The trail led back into the forest, toward the old railway tunnel, disappearing into the undergrowth, exactly where the missing livestock tracks had gone. That evening, the entire family sat at the kitchen table and made a decision that would alter the course of their lives. Heinrich wrote in a letter to his brother that they would leave the property, that no amount of money or pride was worth staying in a place that harbored something so profoundly unnatural. Margaretha's diary entry from that night is brief but emotionally raw. She wrote simply that Annalise could not stop shaking, that her daughter's eyes held a look of violated understanding, as if the natural order of the world had revealed itself to be far more terrible than she had ever imagined. Within 2 weeks, Heinrich had arranged to sell the property. The price he accepted was roughly 60% of what he had paid 3 years earlier. The buyer, a merchant from Salzburg who planned to use the land for timber, heard vague mentions of vagrant problems and strange noises, but nothing of the true reason for the Mullers' desperate urgency to leave. The family moved into a small apartment in Salzburg proper, Heinrich taking on additional work to compensate for their financial loss. Anneliese Miller lived until 2012, passing away at the age of 74-20. In interviews conducted during the final decade of her life, she never wavered from her account of what she had seen that April afternoon. Her voice would become quiet when discussing it, her hands would tremble slightly, but the details remained constant. She described how the encounter had changed something fundamental in her understanding of the world, how she had never again felt entirely safe in wild places, how certain sounds, any rhythmic hissing or scraping, could trigger a visceral fear response that decades had not diminished. The psychological toll on the entire family was severe and lasting. Klaus Miller, in his 2007 interview, described how his father had become withdrawn and bitter after the move, how Heinrich had aged rapidly in the years following their departure from the countryside. The financial loss had been significant, but Klaus believed it was the assault on his father's sense of control and rationality that had truly damaged him. Heinrich had been a practical man, a veteran who had survived the war, someone who prided himself on his ability to protect and provide for his family. The events at the property had revealed the limits of that protection, had forced him to flee from something he could neither fight nor understand. The property itself changed hands several more times over the following decades. Attempts to research subsequent owners' experiences have yielded frustratingly little information. Some records suggest that a timber operation in the 1960s was abandoned unexpectedly, but the reasons remain unclear. The old railway tunnel was officially sealed in 1973 as part of a regional safety initiative, its entrance filled with concrete and rubble. Whether this was a response to anything specific or simply routine maintenance of a dangerous abandoned structure remains a matter of speculation. What remains undeniable is the documentary evidence left by the Müller family. Their letters, Margaretha's diary, and the consistent testimony of the survivors provide a rare, detailed chronicle of what happens when ordinary people confront something that defies their understanding of the natural world. These were not people seeking attention or prone to fantasy. They were a working family living a modest rural life, thrust without warning into an experience that would mark them permanently. The fact that they chose financial hardship over remaining on their property speaks to the genuine terror they experienced, a fear so profound that practical concerns became secondary to the simple need to escape. The scientific pursuit of the Tatzelwurm began in earnest when the 1960s brought a new wave of credibility to cryptozoological research. Universities across Europe, particularly in Switzerland and Austria, found themselves unable to ignore the centuries of consistent testimony from Alpine communities. What had once been dismissed as mountain superstition now demanded systematic investigation, especially after a cluster of sightings near the Swiss-Italian border in 1967 caught the attention of zoologists at the University of Bern. The most methodical early attempt came in the spring of 1969, when a team from the Swiss Zoological Survey mounted an expedition that would set the standard for all subsequent searches. Dr. Heinrich Müller, a herpetologist with 15 years of field experience, assembled a crew of 6 researchers and secured funding from both the university and the Swiss Academy of Sciences. Their objective was straightforward: investigate the 15 most credible sighting locations from the previous 5 years and document whatever fauna inhabited these remote areas. The team carried equipment that was cutting edge for its time, including motion-triggered camera traps adapted from wildlife research programs, plaster casting materials for tracks, and environmental sampling gear. For 6 weeks, the team worked their way through ravines and abandoned mining tunnels in the Bernese Oberland region. They established camera stations at tunnel mouths near fresh water springs and along game trails where witnesses had reported encounters. The cameras clicked away day and night, capturing images of chamois, red foxes, alpine salamanders, and the occasional hiker. But Müller's team also discovered something that kept them in the field longer than originally planned. In 3 separate locations, all of them old transport tunnels carved through mountain seeds in the previous century, they found unusual track marks pressed into the damp mud that accumulated where groundwater seeped through tunnel walls. The tracks measured approximately 15 centimeters in length, showing what appeared to be 4 distinct toe impressions and a heel drag mark that suggested a heavy-bodied animal moving with a peculiar gait. Dr. Müller made detailed casts of 7 separate prints, noting in his field journal that the spacing between tracks indicated either a very short stride or a creature that moved in lurching intervals. The prints were too large for any known alpine amphibian, yet they appeared in locations where reptiles should not have survived the winter temperatures. More puzzling was the fact that these tracks seemed to begin and end abruptly, appearing in the middle of mud patches with no clear entry or exit trails. The team's official report, published in 1970 in the Journal of Alpine Ecology, carefully avoided sensational claims. Müller described the prints as belonging to an unidentified animal and suggested several mundane possibilities, including deformed specimens of known species or unusual movement patterns of common creatures. Yet in private correspondence that would later surface in academic archives, Muller admitted to colleagues that the tracks troubled him deeply. He could not make them fit any animal in the existing zoological record for the region. The 1969 expedition concluded without definitive answers, but with enough ambiguous evidence to justify continued interest. Throughout the 1970s, sporadic attempts by individual researchers yielded similar frustration. A French team working in the maritime Alps in 1974 reported strange scraping sounds in abandoned border fortifications, but captured nothing on film. An Austrian graduate student spent an entire summer in 1977 interviewing witnesses and exploring caves, emerging with hundreds of pages of testimony, but no physical evidence. The pattern was becoming clear to everyone involved in the search. The Tatzelwurm, if it existed, seemed to inhabit the precise margins where human technology and observation could not quite reach. The most ambitious and unsettling expedition came in August of 1983, when a German cryptozoology organization called the Institute for Unknown Species dispatched a well-funded team into the abandoned railway tunnels of the Vorarlberg region near the Austrian-Swiss border. Led by Dr. Klaus Brenner, a zoologist who had grown frustrated with mainstream academia's dismissal of cryptid research. The team included 2 sound engineers, a documentary filmmaker, and a local historian who had collected Tatzelwurm accounts for decades. They chose the old Arlberg railway tunnels, sections of which had been decommissioned in the 1950s when new routes were established. These tunnels penetrated deep into the mountains, with side passages and ventilation shafts creating a labyrinth of dark spaces where anything might hide unseen. The team planned a 7-day expedition, establishing a base camp at the mouth of the main tunnel and conducting daily forays into the deeper sections. They brought portable generators, high-powered lamps, motion sensors, and professional-grade audio recording equipment designed to capture sounds across a wide frequency range. From the beginning, they encountered unexpected resistance from the local community. 3 guides they hired refused to enter certain sections of the tunnel system, even when offered payment that exceeded a month's normal wages. The men would not explain their reluctance with any precision, speaking only of family warnings and old knowledge about which passages should be left alone. One guide, an older man named Josef, finally told Brenner that his grandfather had worked on the original tunnel construction in the 1890s and had witnessed something in the deep workings that he would never describe, not even on his deathbed. The grandfather had only insisted that certain areas contained creatures that belonged to the mountain's bones, and that men who disturbed them invited misfortune. Josef would lead the team to the tunnel entrance, but would go no further, spending his days at the base camp, tending the equipment, and clearly anxious for the researchers to finish their work and leave. Despite these ominous warnings, the German team pressed forward with methodical determination. The first 3 days yielded routine results. They cataloged the tunnel ecosystem, finding it largely barren, except for occasional bats and the insects that fed on organic debris washed in by groundwater. Temperature readings showed the deep sections maintained a constant 8 degrees Celsius year-round, cold enough to deter most animals but potentially suitable for cold-blooded creatures adapted to such conditions. The tunnels smelled of wet stone and mineral deposits, with pools of standing water in the lowest sections where the original drainage systems had failed. On the 4th night, while recording ambient sound in a section approximately 800 meters from the entrance, the team captured something extraordinary. The audio engineers, working in total darkness to avoid contaminating their recordings with equipment noise, heard a series of sounds that made them immediately signal for the others. The sound, later analyzed extensively back in Germany, consisted of a prolonged hissing that rose and fell in volume, interspersed with what could only be described as clicking or scraping noises against stone. The recording lasted 3 minutes and 40 seconds before stopping as abruptly as it had begun. When the team played back the recording at base camp, even Joseph reacted with visible alarm, insisting it was the sound old-timers had warned about, though he had never heard it himself until that moment. The sound engineers confirmed the recording was genuine, not the product of equipment malfunction or environmental noise like wind or water. The frequency analysis showed components that suggested a biological origin, something produced by vocal structures or the movement of a creature across rough surfaces. Yet it matched nothing in their reference library of known alpine animals. The team returned to the same location the following night, hoping to capture video to accompany the audio. This is when the equipment malfunctions began. Cameras that had functioned perfectly for days suddenly experienced battery failures, despite being fully charged. Motion sensors triggered repeatedly with nothing visible in the recorded frames. Most disturbing was the complete failure of their main lighting rig, which experienced an electrical short that none of them could explain, plunging the team into darkness 800 meters underground while they were attempting to set up observation posts. Dr. Brenner noted in his expedition log that the psychological effect of these malfunctions was profound. Rational explanations existed for each individual failure, the cold temperature affecting batteries, moisture causing electrical shorts, but the clustering of these problems in one location during their most promising lid felt like more than coincidence. Two team members advocated for abandoning the deep tunnel work, suggesting they focus on the outer sections where they could maintain better equipment reliability and safety margins. Brenner himself admitted feeling a persistent sensation of being watched in the deeper passages, a feeling he attributed to the sensory deprivation of absolute darkness and the weight of stone overhead, yet which nonetheless affected his judgment. On the sixth night, they captured another audio recording, this time in a different section of the tunnel system, connected to the first location by a ventilation shaft. The sounds were similar, hissing and scraping, but included a new element, a deep resonant vibration that registered at the lower limit of human hearing. This infrasound component, when analyzed, showed characteristics known to induce feelings of unease and fear in humans, possibly explaining the dread that witnesses and even experienced researchers reported in these locations. Yet, whether the sound was produced deliberately by an animal or was simply a coincidental acoustic property of the tunnel architecture remained impossible to determine. The expedition concluded after 7 days with compelling audio evidence, inexplicable equipment failures, and the same fundamental frustration that had plagued every serious search. They had found enough to convince themselves that something warranted further investigation, but nothing definitive enough to convince skeptics or secure additional funding. The German team's documentary footage and audio recordings circulated among cryptozoology enthusiasts throughout the 1980s, becoming some of the most analyzed evidence in Tatzelwurm research, yet ultimately proving nothing beyond doubt. Dr. Brenner continued searching intermittently until his death in 2003, never finding the conclusive proof he sought. In his final interview, conducted just months before he passed away, he spoke about the peculiar torture of cryptozoological research. "You find just enough to know something is there," he said, "just enough to make turning away feel like intellectual cowardice, but never enough to satisfy the burden of scientific proof. The Tatzelwurm remains in that space, real enough to the people who live in its territory, real enough to keep researchers returning to dark tunnels and remote ravines, yet perpetually beyond the reach of cameras and conclusive documentation." The resistance of local guides to entering certain spaces became as much a part of the mystery as the creature itself. These were not superstitious peasants but experienced mountain men who worked as professional guides, who knew every meter of their territory, yet who maintained absolute boundaries about where they would and would not go. Their refusal represented knowledge passed through generations, a collective memory that something in those dark places demanded respect and distance, whether science could explain it or not. The winter of 2009 brought with it an event that would blur the line between Alpine folklore and documented reality in a way that no previous account ever had. Deep beneath the mountains along the Austrian-Italian border, crews working on the Brenner Base Tunnel were pushing through a particularly challenging section of rock when they encountered something that would bring one of Europe's largest infrastructure projects to a complete standstill. The Brenner Base Tunnel, when completed, would become one of the longest railway tunnels in the world, a feat of modern engineering designed to connect Innsbruck in Austria with Fortezza in Italy through 55 kilometers of solid mountain. Hundreds of workers operated around the clock in shifts, using the most advanced tunneling machinery available. These were not superstitious villagers telling stories by firelight. These were experienced construction professionals, many with decades of underground work behind them, operating in an environment of electric lights, constant radio communication, and rigorous safety protocols. On the night of February 23, 2009, the late shift crew breached into a previously unknown natural cavity in Section 7B of the tunnel system. The geological surveys had not predicted this hollow space, which the crews estimated to be roughly 15 meters wide and perhaps 30 meters long. The air that rushed out when they broke through carried a distinctive smell that several workers later described as musty and reptilian, though none could adequately explain what they meant by that last descriptor. The crew foreman, a man named Klaus Bernstein, who had worked tunnel construction for 32 years across 4 countries, made the decision to enter the cavity and assess whether it posed any structural risks to the surrounding tunnel sections. He selected 3 workers to accompany him, all veterans of the project. They entered the space at approximately 11:45 that evening, equipped with high-powered work lights, radio headsets, and standard safety gear. What happened in the following 20 minutes would be documented in incident reports, witness statements, and eventually leaked internal memos that would spread across the internet, despite the company's best efforts at containment. The 4 men had advanced perhaps 20 meters into the cavity when their lights caught something moving along the far wall. At first, Bernstein later testified, he assumed it was water, perhaps a stream running down the rock face. But the movement was wrong. It was too purposeful, too coordinated. Then the thing turned toward their lights, and 4 experienced tunnel workers saw something that made them question everything they thought they knew about what lived beneath the Alps. The creature, as all 4 would consistently describe it in separate interviews conducted over the following days, was between 2 and 3 meters in length, from its blunt snout to what appeared to be a thick, muscular tail. Its body was covered in scales that gleamed in their work lights, reflecting the beams in a way that made the thing seem to shimmer and shift, even as it remained still, watching them. But it was the front limbs that transfixed them all. Disproportionately large compared to the rest of the body, these appendages ended in claws that one worker, a man named Josef Eder, described as looking like gardening tools, curved and wickedly sharp. The creature held itself in a posture that was neither fully reptilian nor mammalian, raised up on those massive front legs in a way that suggested both power and a disturbing kind of intelligence. And then there were the eyes. All 4 men, in reports filed independently before they had a chance to confer with one another, mentioned the eyes. Large, far too large for the body, they reflected the work lights back at the men with a green-gold luminescence that seemed almost to glow from within. One worker would later tell his wife, in a conversation she would eventually share with a local journalist, that the eyes suggested awareness, that whatever this thing was, it was not simply an animal reacting on instinct. It was evaluating them, making decisions about them. The creature remained motionless for perhaps 10 seconds, though every man present would later swear it felt like minutes. Then it moved, and the speed with which it could propel itself across the uneven cave floor shattered any remaining composure the crew possessed. It did not come directly at them, but rather scuttled sideways and up, moving partially along the wall in a way that defied their understanding of how a creature of that size and apparent weight should be able to move. Klaus Bernstein, to his credit, maintained enough presence of mind to order his crew to back out of the cavity in an organized retreat rather than an all-out panicked run. But it was a close thing. The men could hear the creature moving in the darkness beyond their light beams, could hear the scratch and scrape of those massive claws finding purchase on stone. One worker, Helmut Graf, reported that he saw the thing's tail whip past in his peripheral vision, close enough that he felt the displacement of air against his neck. They sealed the opening immediately upon exiting, using emergency barricade procedures typically reserved for imminent cave-ins. Bernstein filed his incident report within the hour, and by morning, Section 7B had been declared off-limits pending investigation. But that was far from the end of the matter. Over the next 3 days, as the official investigation team examined the site, workers in adjacent tunnel sections began reporting sounds. Scratching sounds, they said, coming from within the walls themselves. Deep, rhythmic scraping that would continue for minutes at a time before falling silent. Some workers refused to continue operating machinery in certain sections, claiming the vibrations seemed to agitate whatever was making the sounds. Equipment operators reported their vehicles being struck by impacts that sensors recorded, but that investigation revealed no external source for. On the morning of February 26, 2009, a maintenance crew discovered something near one of the ventilation shafts in Section 6C, adjacent to the sealed cavity. Draped across a support beam was what appeared to be a length of shed skin, translucent and brittle, measuring approximately 1 meter in length and covered in a pattern of scales that matched the descriptions the original crew had provided. The physical evidence was photographed, documented, and then quickly disappeared into official channels, though not before several workers had captured images on personal cell phones. One of these images would eventually leak online, though its authenticity has been debated endlessly. The photograph shows what appears to be a papery, scale-covered membrane held between gloved hands. Skeptics argue it could be anything from industrial plastic to clever fabrication. Those who saw it in person, however, maintain absolute certainty about what they were looking at. This was biological material, they insist, and it was like nothing any of them had encountered in decades of underground construction work. The decision to permanently seal Section 7B and reroute the tunnel came on February 27, 2009. The official documentation cites previously undetected geological instability. A risk assessment that determined the cavity represented a structural compromise that could threaten the integrity of the entire tunnel section. The cost of rerouting was estimated at approximately 8 million euros, a staggering sum that raised questions among project oversight committees about whether the geological concerns truly warranted such an extreme measure. But within the company, among the workers and lower-level management, a different story circulated. The decision to seal and reroute had not been made by engineers or geologists. It had been made by the men who would have had to continue working in those sections, and by supervisors who had seen the fear in the eyes of workers who had been underground for decades without ever showing hesitation. Something was down there, the rumor went. Something that the official reports would never acknowledge, but that everyone who worked the Brenner project understood was real. Leaked internal communications, obtained by Austrian investigative journalists in 2010, revealed the extent of the concern at executive levels. One memo, dated March 2, 2009, referred to the need to maintain absolute discretion regarding the incident and noted that several workers had requested transfers to other sections of the project, or had left entirely. Another document outlined a psychological evaluation protocol, suggesting that the company was concerned about the mental state of the witnesses, but also, reading between the lines, taking their accounts seriously enough to document them thoroughly. Worker testimonies, some provided confidentially to researchers in the years following the incident, painted a picture of those 3 days that was far more unsettling than the official reports suggested. Men spoke of a palpable atmosphere of wrongness in the tunnel sections near the sealed cavity. Several described feeling watched, even in areas where visual surveillance should have been impossible. Equipment malfunctions spiked during that period, with no clear technical explanation for the failure. One testimony, provided by a welder who requested anonymity, described hearing vocalizations on the night of February 25th. Not human sounds, he insisted, but not quite animal either. A series of hissing clicks that seemed to echo through the ventilation system in a pattern that suggested communication rather than random noise. When he reported this to his supervisor, he was told to focus on his work and not spread rumors, but he noticed that additional security personnel appeared in his section within the hour. The physical description provided by the original 4 witnesses gained particular significance when researchers began comparing it to historical Tatzelwurm accounts. The disproportionately large front limbs, the scaled body, the size, even the luminous eyes, all aligned with descriptions that stretched back centuries across the Alpine region. But now, for the first time, these descriptions came not from terrified peasants glimpsing something in forest shadows, but from educated professionals seeing something under controlled lighting conditions in a confined space where misidentification should have been nearly impossible. The incident reignited the Tatzelwurm mystery in a way that no previous account had managed. Here was a modern encounter, documented in official reports, witnessed by multiple credible observers, occurring in a context where the usual explanations of misidentification or folkloric exaggeration seemed inadequate. The construction company's decision to seal the section and accept the massive financial cost of rerouting suggested that whatever had been encountered was taken seriously at the highest levels, regardless of what the public documentation stated. In the years since 2009, the Brenner Base Tunnel has continued its slow progress through the mountains. Section 7B remains sealed, officially due to geological concerns, but workers on the project still speak of it in hushed tones. The section has acquired its own nickname among the crews. They call it the Dragon's Gate, though no official document will ever acknowledge that name or the reason behind it. The Brenner incident stands as perhaps the most compelling modern evidence for the existence of something in the Alps that science has not yet catalogued. It represents the collision of ancient folklore with contemporary reality, witnessed by people whose credibility is difficult to dismiss and documented in ways that previous generations could never have managed. Whatever moved in that cavity deep beneath the Austrian-Italian border on that winter night in 2009, it left behind questions that remain unanswered and a mystery that refuses to rest quietly in the darkness where it was sealed away. The question refuses to fade into history. Despite the passage of centuries, despite the march of science and reason through every corner of our modern world, the Tatzelwurm endures not as myth, but as mystery. And perhaps what haunts us most is not what we know, but what we cannot explain. Consider the weight of the evidence, not in its conclusiveness, but in its consistency. From the 16th century to the present day, witnesses separated by hundreds of years and thousands of kilometers have described the same creature. A serpentine body covered in scales, front legs ending in claws, a cat-like face with luminous eyes, a hiss that freezes the blood. These details emerge again and again from farmers who could not read, from engineers with university degrees, from children who had never heard the name Tatzelwurm, from skeptics who did not believe until the moment they saw. The descriptions cross linguistic barriers. German speakers in Austria call it Tatzelwurm. French speakers in the Alps know it as Erasas. Italian communities refer to it as Basilisco alpino. Swiss locals whisper of the stolen worm. Yet, strip away the different names, and the creature they describe remains fundamentally identical. This is not the normal evolution of folklore, where details shift and transform with each retelling. This is something else entirely. Modern sightings have not decreased. They have simply become harder to dismiss. The Swiss hikers in 1998 who photographed something emerging from rocks. The Austrian biology students in 2001 whose video footage shows a fast-moving reptilian shape disappearing into a crevasse. The construction workers in 2009 who refused to continue excavating a particular tunnel section without armed security present. These are not medieval peasants prone to superstition. These are educated citizens of the 21st century, people who own smartphones and understand the scientific method, people who had everything to lose by reporting what they saw. What did those construction workers encounter in the darkness beneath the Alps? The project manager filed an incident report that remains sealed by the contracting company. 3 workers requested immediate transfer to different projects. 1 quit the construction industry entirely. The tunnel section in question was eventually completed, but it required rotating crews who were not informed of the previous incident. To this day, maintenance workers draw lots to determine who must inspect that particular stretch. The losers do so quickly, never alone, never without multiple light sources and an open radio channel to the surface. Local populations near certain Alpine regions maintain an unspoken geography of dread. Specific valleys where shepherds will not graze their flocks. Particular cave systems that hiking guides refuse to enter despite their popularity with tourists. Old mining tunnels that remain unsealed yet unexplored, not because of structural concerns or toxic gases, but because of something the locals will not articulate to outsiders. When pressed, they offer vague warnings about bad air or unstable rocks. But spend enough time in these villages, earn enough trust, and the real reason emerges in whispered conversations. There are places where the mountain does not want you. There are depths that should remain undisturbed. The absence of a body proves nothing. The Alps encompass over 200,000 square kilometers of some of the most rugged and inaccessible terrain on Earth. The mountain range contains an estimated 40,000 caves, most never fully explored. Thousands of kilometers of abandoned mining tunnels snake through the rock, many sealed or forgotten since the Middle Ages. Modern geological surveys using ground-penetrating radar have revealed enormous voids deep beneath the mountains, cavern systems that have never felt sunlight, spaces where entire ecosystems could exist unknown to science. We assume we know our planet. We assume that in the age of satellite imagery and GPS mapping, nothing significant remains hidden. But the depth of the Alps has barely been scratched. Every year, new cave systems are discovered. Every year, construction projects break through into previously unknown voids. The Gotthard Base Tunnel, completed in 2016 as the world's longest railway tunnel, required drilling through 57 kilometers of alpine rock. The engineers encountered water-filled caverns no one knew existed, geological formations that contradicted previous surveys, and according to several workers who spoke off the record, things that could not be explained. The scientific objection remains food supply. How could a breeding population of unknown reptiles survive in an environment with limited resources? But this objection assumes we understand the full ecology of the deep alpine environment. We do not. Cave systems around the world have revealed entire food chains, based not on photosynthesis, but on chemosynthesis, organisms feeding on chemical reactions in the rock itself. Blind fish, translucent crustaceans, bacteria that metabolize minerals. Life finds ways we never anticipated. The Tatzelwurm, if it exists, would not need to be a large population. A handful of individuals ranging across enormous territories could account for the sporadic sightings. Certain deep-sea fish are seen by humans perhaps once every decade, yet we acknowledge their existence. The coelacanth, a fish believed extinct for 66 million years, was rediscovered in 1938. The Sola, a large mammal in Vietnam, remained unknown to science until 1992. The planet still harbors secret. What disturbs skeptics most is not the eyewitness testimony, which can be dismissed as misidentification or delusion. What disturbs them is the physical evidence that exists but cannot be explained. The claw marks in granite, too large for any known alpine animal, found deep in caves far from any entrance. The shed skin discovered by spelunkers in Austria in 2007. Tissue samples that degraded before proper analysis but were described as reptilian scales of unusual size. The consistent disruption of wildlife in certain regions, where deer refuse to enter specific valleys and birds avoid nesting near particular cliff faces. The mystery persists because it cannot be cleanly resolved. We have no body, no bones, no definitive proof, but we have centuries of consistent reports, witnesses who gain nothing from their testimony except ridicule, physical traces that hint at something unknown, and vast unexplored territories where concealment remains entirely possible. Every year, humanity digs deeper into the Alps. New tunnels for high-speed rail, expanded hydroelectric facilities, geothermal energy projects, mining operations seeking rare earth elements. We are penetrating regions that have remained untouched since the mountains formed. We are disturbing environments that have existed in darkness and silence for millions of years. And if something has lived there all this time, adapted to the deep and the dark, we are entering its territory now. The next encounter could happen at any moment. A tunnel boring machine breaking through into an unexplored cavern. A cave expedition pushing into virgin passage. A geologist taking core samples from rock that has never been breached. And perhaps this time, the witness will have better equipment. Perhaps this time, the evidence will be undeniable. Or perhaps, like all the times before, we will be left with testimony, with questions, with the nagging sense that something exists just beyond the reach of our understanding. The Tatzelwurm remains unexplained. That is the haunting truth. Not disproven, not revealed, but unexplained. And in the depths beneath Europe's most traversed mountains, in the darkness of unmapped caves and forgotten tunnels, the possibility endures. Whatever the truth may be, it waits in the deep places, patient and hidden, while we dig ever closer to discovery or disaster. That's where this journey ends for tonight. If you made it all the way here, subscribe and hit the bell for more long-form stories like this. Check out the videos on screen for more right now. Drop your own experiences in the comments below. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you in the next one.